Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Inside Movies Galore. I'm your host, David Streggy, and here in the room with me, I have Small Town Monsters director Seth Breedlove. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It'd be funny if you had just left it at Small Town Monsters, since that's probably how most people just know me at this point.
Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in doing documentaries?
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird sort of roundabout way that I took to get to filmmaking as sort of my job.
Okay.
And it's not really it's not a career path that I can define for people who try to who want to do what I'm doing. It's such a weird, like, random string of events that brought us to this point. But I was always into filmmaking from a very young age, and I wanted to be, a director when I was graduating high school. That was the big thing for me, was I want to be a film director. And of course, that was 1999 when I was graduating. So it was a completely different time. As ridiculous as that seems, considering it's not all that long ago. But I mean, things have changed so drastically. Things have changed just since we started doing SDM in 2014. So just between now and then, we've seen the audience have the chance to grow because of the proliferation of digital streaming media and some of these platforms opening up. But yeah, basically, the short answer is I'm interested in bizarre subjects like the paranormal and Bigfoot and cryptozoology and all that stuff. And I have this horrible habit wherein if I'm into a subject and it's like a hobby, I can't just let it remain a hobby for too long. I inevitably try to make it like my job or something I have to do. I have to somehow be throwing something back out into the ether that I've created that sort of draws from that. And so in 2013, I put together a book proposal called Small Town Monsters. That was basically like a case book of cases that revolved around rural communities that had been sort of at one time in major media due to like some sort of local event that revolved around a monster, like a cryptid or something like that. So I put together this book proposal and I sent it around. It was unanimously rejected. And a few months later, I met these guys that had video equipment who wanted to do something with me, and as sort of a collaboration that would draw off of.
So what started out as a book project ended up being a documentary.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, it's not that it's no different from what the book proposal was. It's just spread out into films instead of chapters, and we've actually made four or five of our films were in the initial book proposal.
Okay.
So we've drawn off that, none more so than our first, which was Minerva Monster, which I had literally written the chapter in the book already for that, and interviewed original witnesses and people that were tied to that case. So yeah, it started in 2014, and we made Minerva Monster, and that did well enough as an independent film that we could sort of throw the money we made from that back into making another movie, which was our second film called Beast of Whitehall. Then we just sort of repeated that pattern. And all along, we were also running Kickstarter campaigns at the beginning of each year, and so everything was like everything was independent from the very beginning. It's just that when we're at the point where we are now, it's insane to me to be able to look back and see that we've managed to grow the company the way we have, completely independently and autonomously. And yeah, so I guess that's the short end of it. The short answer is that's how it all became what it is.
Well, before I get into talking with you about your first project, Minerva, which you've already mentioned, you are actually my first documentary person that I've had on the show that has had anything to do with documentaries.
Cool.
So why don't you tell the audience what you think a document on film is?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's documentary should be at least the way that we're telling them. Obviously, this doesn't run the gamut, and there's a number of different ways to do documentaries. But ours are very objective, journalistic approaches to well-known sort of real world subjects, and obviously, we are covering a subgenre of that is super bizarre and not taken very seriously. So we do try to approach it in a way that just kind of puts it out there and lets the audience make up their own mind. And typically we keep ourselves out of the films we're making too. It's not like I'm Michael Moore in these documentaries. It's now that changes with something like On the Trail of, which is our miniseries that we do. We do one of those each year as well. But the films themselves are just really cinematically retelling real world events in a way that's entertaining and exciting,
Okay.
but also does a fair share of historical preservation as well. So that is our sort of modus operandi when it comes to running Small Town Monsters films.
Okay. Now, diving into Minerva Monsters, the documentary. Now, did you go and find a cast for your documentary, or did you just go out and just find some people that you needed to interview? And
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, I was actually writing for newspapers as a freelance reporter, and I did that for a number of years. So, like, I drew off of some of the skills I had learned as a reporter,
Okay.
especially early on. But I mean, still to this day, obviously. But yeah, we actually, what we did is we went back and when I say we, I guess at that point it was just me. I would go back and I'd go into the original sort of newspaper archives. The Minerva Monster case happened in 1978, but it was very mainstream. It was covered by two local papers here in Ohio, but it blew up, and those stories ended up getting picked up by the Associated Press, ran coast to coast, and eventually, like, the story went international, and you had media from Japan and Germany coming to Ohio to cover the Minerva Monster case. So I went through those newspaper articles, picked up as many names as I could, and then just started contacting people that were mentioned by
Okay.
name. And in a lot of those cases, the people had passed on and things like that. But I mean, this was also like our first attempt at making a movie. And none of us knew what we're doing. I think to an extent, none of us know what we're doing today either. But like back then, we really had no clue, and there was no inkling of like trying to capture a certain look or mood or visually. It was all over the place, and it was really just handy cams, whatever cameras we had on hand at the time.
Mhm.
But I did know that I didn't want to make a documentary that was done like every other television nonfiction show that was focused on cryptids and the paranormal at the time. All those shows focused on sort of following a group of leads running through the woods trying to find a monster or a ghost or whatever. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to talk to the actual people who were involved in the case. So we interviewed one of the ladies that wrote the articles for the local paper. We interviewed the sheriff, the Stark County sheriff at the time, who was at the time, I think he was a deputy and was just tasked with sort of investigating what I'm pretty sure he thought was sort of like a hoax or something strange at the time.
Mhm.
And then we interviewed members of the family and other people locally who'd had sightings, and that was what we did. There were no recreations. There was no. It's very different from something like Momo, which comes
Okay.
out later this year. I mean, it's almost the bizarro Momo. Like Momo's is 50 or 60% narrative, and then maybe 40-50% documentary.
Okay.
And Minerva Monster is like as straightforward of a documentary as you can get.
Okay. So now, what areas of Ohio did you end up going to that you may not have mentioned in your documentary? What locales did you use?
Sure. Yeah. We tried to focus mostly on the town of Minerva, because like the entire idea originally, and this has expanded and changed obviously, with our films going forward. But initially, the idea was to really just focus on one small town, and we started with Minerva. We did interview one other person in that film from like East Canton, which is about 15 minutes west, I think it is, of Minerva. But it was almost entirely in this tiny town, called Minerva, Ohio, which is only about maybe like 15-20 minutes from where I grew up in Bolivar, Ohio.
Okay.
And it's a very little, very, very small, very rural community that sits just off the Lincoln Highway, which of course the Lincoln Highway runs coast to coast. And there's like a whole movie waiting to be made about all the weird crap that's happened in small towns off of the Lincoln Highway. But yeah, that movie was focused entirely there, just in Minerva.
Okay. Now, did you use the narrator from your first documentary and other documentaries?
Minerva was actually, it was told in a way that we haven't done since, which was there was no narrator. It was entirely told through the witnesses and other interview subjects.
Okay.
And like I said, no recreations, very little in the way of like illustrations or anything like that. And like I personally have a very difficult time watching Minerva these days,
Okay.
but I'm told by people that they enjoy it still. To me, I see so many of the mistakes we made when I try to watch it. But I will say the idea of making a documentary without a narrator really appeals to me, and I kind of want to. I keep wanting to go back to that, just to try it now that we've learned so much about film editing and things like that. I think we could do something really interesting with that storytelling device.
Okay. Moving on to your Beast of Whitehall production. Was there anything? Now, in this documentary, you did use a narrative, correct?
Yeah, and that one a buddy of mine named Clint Granberry, who actually worked in radio, did the narration. And yeah, that one was where we finally, there were so many things we missed out on with Minerva without having a narrator, because the best thing about a narrator is they can distill a lot of information into a very short period of time. So you can just have a narrator say, 3 sentences, and all of a sudden you're getting through all the information that would have been really drug out in a I guess just interviews or whatever. So we were lucky enough to have Clint on hand with Beast of Bray Road, and he did he handled the narration for that one. And yeah, and I mean, that's the other thing is Beast of Whitehall is a 39-minute movie, whereas Minerva was scaled back. Initially, there were cuts of Minerva that were like 90 minutes long. So very consciously, like even from the beginning, we had no interest in trying to reach some sort of self-made goal like runtime. It was always like whatever's best for the story, and I just felt like 39 minutes on Beast of Whitehall, we got in, we told the story, and then we got out. And we try to do that actually with every movie. There's no attempt to sort of reach a runtime goal to sort of make ourselves feel more legitimate as filmmakers, despite the fact that I see that happen quite a bit with reviews and stuff by quote unquote film nerds sort of critiquing our stuff and saying it's not long enough or it's too too short or whatever.
Totally understand. Now, where did you take your investigative looks in for Beast of Whitehall, locations for this particular documentary?
Well, that one was cool because we did broaden. It went way out beyond what Minerva had done. Minerva was very concentrated in that one small community, and Beast of Whitehall sort of took in all of upstate New York, especially the Adirondacks, and it covered a wide range of terrain and geography and all that kind of stuff. But it also was filmed. I mean, we filmed in many different places while we were in upstate New York. I mean, we filmed probably some of the locations were 200 miles apart, and so it was filmed in a wide array of places across the Adirondacks, and even into Vermont a little bit
Okay.
up there. But Whitehall, New York itself sits on the banks of Lake Champlain, and is sort of like this gorgeous one time, very prosperous town that's seen better days, as so many of the small towns that we cover have. But it's a really neat town. It was in a gorgeous location. It's like one of the only locations where we filmed where I want to own some sort of like summer home or move there. But yeah, it was all over upstate New York.
Okay. Was there any particular shot or scene that was a favorite of yours while you were in the editing room?
Like with Beast of Whitehall, some of the drone footage coming down Aber Road, and at the time, like I was flying a GoPro. I think it was like a GoPro Hero 1. I think it was just the first generation GoPro on a Phantom 2. And it looks terrible now when I watch it. I actually just watched some of it over the weekend, but there's something really neat about that movie to me. I've always called it my baby because I went out and I bought this camera, a Sony Nex VG900, which was a camcorder body, but an interchangeable lens camera. And it was sort of this weird melding of like DSLR with camcorder. And it was literally a handycam body, but you could screw on an interchangeable lens. And I had just bought it. So most of the movie is like me trying to figure out how to focus because I had never filmed before. And then when I watch it now, like it's really interesting to me because the whole movie is shot by me. Like pretty much every shot is me. And it's like watching, a toddler take their first steps or something. And like there's a lot in that movie that I really enjoy now, even though, obviously there's a ton of flaws and it's very amateurish, but yeah, I'm really proud of that movie. So it'd be hard to nail it down, but I do enjoy some of the drone footage coming down Aber Road and stuff like that.
Okay. Moving on to your Boggy Creek film. How did you get involved in that project?
The Boggy Creek Monster, we had actually been talking with Lyle Blackburn for going all the way back to the making of our Minerva Monster film in 2014.
Okay.
I had begun speaking with Lyle, and Lyle is sort of the Boggy Creek historian. If there's a simple way to sort of distill what he does, he obviously he's done a lot of investigations into like Bigfoot sightings around Fouke, Arkansas, but he was also sort of a historian of the movie, the original Legend of Boggy Creek film from the 1970s. He had done a lot of tracking down of like people that had appeared in that movie and things like that. And so we had hooked up with Lyle, and he wanted to make a movie that was essentially sort of a retelling of a book he had written called The Beast of Boggy Creek.
Okay.
That sort of distilled years, like decades of history of sightings of the Fouke monster. And then, like how those sightings sort of influenced the original Legend of Boggy Creek movie, and then how those sightings continued after the making of that movie. And so, like that is the one Small Town Monsters film that we've made where it's like based on the work of, someone, and it's Lyle Blackburn in that case. So it was basically just a retelling of his book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, and we, it was filmed down in Fouke, Arkansas. I think that was filmed in the April of 2016.
Okay. And now, how was that film's reception?
You know what? Like, it's a weird thing because we thought that would be like the big, Small Town Monsters blow up movie, like the one that would finally catapult us into, from like this very cult sort of status, which we still are at today. But it really didn't play out that way. I think the reception to it has been solid, and it won some film festival awards because back then I was still actually submitting movies to film festivals, which we don't
Okay.
even really bother with that anymore. But the reception was solid. It's like when I watch it now, it's the one that I pick apart the easiest. Like it's way too long. It needs scenes cut out. Actually, when we signed a release deal for that with Terror Films a couple of years ago, and when they gave me the opportunity to sort of like fiddle with it before they put it out. So I actually I recut the final act of that movie and changed it around a little bit. So if I could, I'd go back and do a director's cut, but it would be like 20 minutes shorter than the actual final cut of the movie. But the reception was good, and people still tell me, like I still talk to people today that claim that's like their favorite Bigfoot movie.
Okay. Very cool. Now, did you use a different narrator for that particular documentary? Or?
Yeah, so that was sort of the first one where Lyle stepped into the role of narrator, and he's still narrating Small Town Monsters projects today. Not everyone, but he did the narration for that, and then he did the Mothman of Point Pleasant, and then he did the Bray Road Beast and Terror in the Skies, which just came out as well.
Oh, okay. Cool. Now, did you go anywhere else besides where Boggy Creek is for this documentary, or did you just stay in?
No, I mean that was spread out. Yeah, that was spread out as well across southern Arkansas and even into like Louisiana and Texas a little bit, because you're down on it's a border state with all three of those states sort of right there. You've also got Oklahoma pretty close by. But I mean that was the shoot where we were convinced we were all going to die at any given moment, because like there were alligators and chiggers and fire ants, and one of my guys stepped out of a van when we had first gotten there and stepped right over a copperhead snake. And I mean there was, you know, the running.
Someone in your crew would be going like crikey, and then all of a sudden an alligator.
Yeah. It was the running gag was that everything down there wanted to kill us, including feral packs of feral pit bulls that roam around the Arkansas woods as well. So yeah, that was shot all over those what they call the bottomlands, which are very swampy sort of runoffs from some of the major rivers down there. And it's a desolate, sort of terrifying place, especially once the sun goes down.
Okay. Now moving on to the Mothman of Point Pleasant. Now, when you went and did that documentary, did you go actually down to Virginia to?
Yeah, we did. That's been one of the easier shoots we've had, actually, because the travel. I'll actually be in Point Pleasant on Friday, Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It's only about 2.5 hours from here.
Okay.
So we would actually, there was only one time during the making of the Mothman of Point Pleasant where we actually stayed in Point Pleasant. Otherwise it was literally like wake up, the whole crew gets in the car and we drive down there for the day and film, then come home in the evening.
Okay.
So it was a very, very easy sort of shoot for us. But you know, like sort of similar to Minerva in that the filming itself was sort of focused solely in that one area. There was one trip out to Charleston, West Virginia to shoot an interview, but otherwise everything was sort of shot right there in Point Pleasant.
Now, how long does it, by this point, did it take you to research enough subject matter for the documentaries themselves?
Yeah, that one was really tough because there's actually a number of movies about the Mothman incident already out. So the task on that was kind of twofold. It wasn't solely about like turning up witnesses and interesting people to sort of tell the Mothman story. It was also about doing that in a way that hadn't been done before.
Mm-hmm.
So we also had to find witnesses and people to talk about it who hadn't been interviewed 100 times in every other documentary out there. So we did manage to turn up a number of original witnesses and people tied to that case that hadn't been on camera before. But the real, like, the turning point for that film was actually Jeff Walmsley, who runs, there's a Mothman museum actually in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. He had a number of audio tapes that he had done years ago with some of the original witnesses who have since passed away. And he gave those to us. We were actually able to use those in the film, and so viewers could actually hear the original witnesses telling their stories for themselves. And then, we sort of covered those over with Chris Scouse animated sequences as well. So yeah, it was a really difficult shoot in that we had to present something that hadn't already been seen, and at the same time make a film that was an introduction to that story, and it has acted as an introduction for most people to the whole Mothman story.
Definitely. Now, moving on from the Mothman of Point Pleasant, you went and out and did Invasion on Chestnut Ridge. How did you get involved in that particular project?
That was like one of those things where we had by then, that was our fifth movie, and we were getting sort of bored with the idea of let's solely tell like one monster, one geographical area. And my friend Mark Matsky, who actually narrated and co-wrote Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, he's a big fan of the work of a investigator named Stan Gordon, who's been sort of a like UFO / cryptid investigator going back to like the 60s. And actually the 50s, I think it'd be 57. But Mark was a big fan of his work, and I thought it would be fun for Mark and I to actually co-write something together and tell these stories that Mark was such a big fan of. So that was the whole impetus for it. Was like, let's just do something fun and different from what we'd already done. It's sort of almost like an anthology film. It's told, it's not completely dissimilar from other STM movies, but it tells like a really wide array of stories, and they're all centered around this one area in Pennsylvania called the Chestnut Ridge. And it starts with a UFO crash, the Kecksburg UFO crash, and then it kind of expands out into Bigfoot stories. And by the time it ends, you're watching people recount seeing orbs in the woods going into portals, and people seeing werewolves and all kind of crazy stuff. So it's a really bizarre movie. I actually just rewatched it over the weekend, and it's one of my favorites of ours. Like, it's so weird, and visually it's really different from everything we've done since then. But yeah, the idea behind it and the whole impetus to do it was just having sort of a fun story to tell with my buddy.
Okay, very cool. Now, did you use a narrator in that particular one as well, or?
Yeah, that was actually Mark. Mark co-wrote it and narrated the film. And he's narrated. He also narrated our On the Trail of Champ miniseries as well.
Okay. Which On the Trail of Champ, that wasn't directed by you, correct?
No, that's the one. Yeah, I just produced that one. It's directed by my buddy Alexander Pedikov.
Okay. And now I'm just gonna talk about the Flatwoods Monster, where you came up to Illinois, correct?
No, Flatwoods is actually West Virginia again. Yeah,
it is.
Flatwoods, West Virginia, and that would have been our. Let me see. That's up to our 6th. So we put that out actually in April of last year of 2018. It came out I think April 3rd of last year. But that story sort of revolves around this strange UFO crash that supposedly happened in 1952 in Flatwoods, West Virginia, and it was followed by a sighting of some sort of 13-foot tall, cylindrical, strange mechanical monster by some kids that happened in 1952. And we made that movie. It was a really different sort of shoot from some of our others. It wasn't done in a short period of time. It was actually a really prolonged, drawn out production schedule in which we actually made 2 other movies sort of while we were working on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was very strange. We started shooting that in July of 2017, which would have been in the smack dab in the middle of doing post-production on Invasion on Chestnut Ridge.
Okay.
So we made that movie. We just kind of shot it whenever we had time. And when it came out, it actually was like the most expensive thing we'd ever done, because we hired Chris Galf to do animation, and then we
Okay.
had Santino Vitali, who's this incredibly talented special effects genius. He did like these really cool stop motion animated sequences and all kinds of cool stuff that we have in that movie. It has a very like 1950s sci-fi B movie vibe to it.
Okay.
And that one was actually a return to being narrated by Clint Granberry, because originally that movie, in the Flatwoods Monster, was going to be packaged by Terror Films with The Beast of Whitehall, but we ended up never doing that for some reason. So we have both those movies narrated by Clint simply because they were originally going to be packaged together, and then it never happened.
Oh, okay. Now, how is the reception for both Invasion on Chestnut Ridge and the Flatwoods Monster?
Invasion's been incredible, because Invasion was sort of a flop when it came out in terms of like sales and rentals. Like it did great on DVD, but it just was not getting picked up in rentals and purchases on Amazon. And that's probably just because it's a weird subject. No one knows what it is. But that movie, once it hit Amazon Prime, it found a whole new audience. And like among the audience that sort of discovered that movie was Adam Wingard, who directed the Blair Witch sequel that just came out a few years ago, and he's making Kong versus Godzilla next year. And Adam actually contacted me shortly after he watched the movie just to talk about like weird paranormal subjects, and so like we became buddies, and there are a number of other people I've talked to since then who sort of discovered that movie. Like that's the movie that got them in the Small Town Monsters movies. So it's either that one or the Mothman and Point Pleasant that sort of stand as my favorites that we've done. But and for Flatwoods was weird, because like Flatwoods came out and it was a 41 minute or 44 minute short film essentially, and it did not find a very large audience upon release.
Okay.
Now one thing I will say about that one is like the shelf life seems to be just continuous for Flatwoods. It's never doing like wildly successful, but it's always got new people sort of discovering it and talking about it. And like visually, it's probably one of my favorite movies of ours, just because it's so short. It's a 44-minute film, but it's chocked full of like animation and recreations, and it's very like exciting visually. And I love that 1950s sort of B movie monster movie vibe that it has. And it also has some of my favorite music by Brandon Dalo. So yeah, the reception to both of them was good. Critically, there at that point in time, there wasn't, our movies weren't really being reviewed by anyone. There was a website, I think maybe Horror Fuel, or like some of the smaller sites would pick up a movie here and there and review it. And the few reviews that did pop up for Flatwoods were really good, but Invasion on Chestnut Ridge had none. Like I don't remember any reviews for it.
You, as a small time reviewer, it was, if I hadn't gotten into documentaries like several years back, I probably would have had a harder time reviewing a documentary, because you don't want to say too much about it, and yet you do want to say enough of it or about it to have people get interested in it.
Yeah, and I also think like the movies are especially back then, the eyes on us were not sort of anywhere near where they are today. It was, like our audience back then was a few 100,000, and today it's like 5 million. So the growth between now and then has been at least substantial enough to get some other eyes on our projects.
Definitely. So after the Flatwoods Monster, which took you to West Virginia, you came over to Wisconsin and filmed one on the Beast of Bray, or the Bray Road Beast.
Yeah, the Beast of Bray Road is fine. We only called it the Bray Road Beast because Linda already had a book called The Beast of Bray Road, and there was actually a movie an asylum movie made for sci-fi
Yeah.
called The Beast of Bray Road, and we didn't want to have to compete with it, so we just changed it up. I mean, it wasn't. It's interesting to go from Flatwoods to Bray Road because the styles and everything about the two of them are very different. The editing styles, the editing technique I used on both of them is polar opposite. One of them is sort of told very methodically and slowly in the Flatwoods Monster, and Bray Road Beast is like crazy quick cutting and all kinds of stuff that I didn't that I kind of had to teach myself at that time. And yeah, the Bray Road Beast was filmed in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, and around that sort of Wisconsin area. And I was just looking at footage from that movie the other night, and it's really interesting to see this sort of like dichotomy between the Midwest of the Bray Road Beast and the Midwest of Terror in the Skies, where you've got Bray Road Beast looks like a real world Tim Burton movie, just because the weather was the way it was when we were there. We were there at the beginning of April, but there had been ice storms all leading all up to that. And there were, for some reason, there were like crows everywhere. And there was constantly these very distinguishable dark clouds. Like every shot is sort of overshadowed by this sky that looks like it's just going to start, dropping lightning at any minute. And it's a very unique looking movie. It's not at all what we went into it sort of planning to do. We were originally, that was going to be like our Hammer homage movie, our big Hammer horror homage movie, and I think it turned into something completely different after we shot one of the interviews, the John Fredrickson interview. John was like an animal control officer who witnessed all this, what he believed was like a cult activity involving animal sacrifices and stuff, and it was such a dark turn that it sort of informed the entire style of the movie going forward. But some of that Hammer kind of like influence is still prevalent in the opening and closing scenes. But yeah, it's a very stark contrast between the Flatwoods Monster, which is a pretty bright and peppy movie, and then the Bray Road Beast, which is the darkest thing we've done.
Okay. So after the Bray Road Beast, from what I understand, what was the reaction to the Bray Road Beast to the public?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our movies, it's the Bray Road Beast and the Mothman of Point Pleasant are why people know us. I think those are probably the two movies that people most typically say are their favorites. The Bray Road Beast, seemed to really be. It received a very strong reception. I think some of that is because it came out close to Halloween. It's so dark and creepy. People really got into what we were going for with that movie.
Okay.
And so, yeah, the reviews were super positive. They continue to be positive to this day. We recently received, contacts from major Hollywood production companies wanting to license footage for like TV shows, like basically reusing our Bray Road Beast footage. We turned them down, but yeah, it's been extremely well received.
Nice. So ultimately, after the Bray Road Beast, you went and started, from what I understand, the On the Trail series.
Well, the On the Trail of series was actually sort of built with On the Trail of Champ, which was directed by Alexander. But what excited me about what Alexander did was that he did it all by himself. He made a 5-episode miniseries that runs almost 2 hours long and entirely by himself. And I wanted to do that myself. But where Alexander was sort of focused on just Lake Champlain, I decided it would be a great idea to expand that out to like the entire United States and tell sort of a retelling of the entire Bigfoot subject from beginning to end. And make a six episode miniseries. And it runs close to 3 hours long. It's just under 3 hours long. And yeah, that was like my quote unquote side project that I started filming last year. And then it was massive in scope. It was supposed to be a fun side project and turned into like the hardest thing I've ever had to sort of work on in post production. I mean, it was constantly evolving and changing during the post production side of things. But you know, it's probably the thing I'm most proud of right now in terms of the work we've done. It just took so much to sort of hammer it into place, and we actually start filming the follow up to that on the Trail of UFOs in about
So
two weeks.
so it's going to be a season 2 of it then.
Season 3, yeah. On the Trail of Champ would be 1. On the Trail of Bigfoot is 2.
Okay.
And yeah. So essentially, it's an ongoing series. It's just easier to break it down to like miniseries format. And then when we release those on Amazon, they're sort of edited into like 1 or 2 movies. Actually, in the case of On the Trail of UFOs, it's probably going to end up being like 3 movies, because On the Trail of UFOs is looking like it's going to be 9 or 10 episodes instead of 6.
Okay. So now. Ultimately, you came over to after that to Chicago to start filming Terror in the Skies.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that project and how you got into it?
Yeah, I mean, Terror in the Skies was sort of, I guess, a response to Bray Road Beast, because Bray Road Beast was so dark. And I kind of wanted to do something that was less dark. And so, yeah, the idea behind that was sort of like drawing off of my love for, visually anyway, for like some of the early Spielberg movies, and you know, doing something that had that like Midwest sort of spirit to it. Something that was a look at not just like 1 or 2 cryptid phenomena, but multiple. So we covered, you know, Thunderbirds and prehistoric people that claim to have seen like pterodactyls in the skies above Illinois, and then also like the Chicago Mothman as well, and do it all through this lens of you know, like what that area, what that sort of you know, that what they call the prairie state, what that looks like, and how the terrain changes so drastically and all that kind of stuff, and really like delve into how these like winged birds or giant winged cryptids that people have been seeing there for literally for centuries, and how it's sort of baked into the history of Illinois itself.
Nice. And now, is there a particular scene from any of the documentaries that we've talked about so far that you would like to share with us about from Terror in the Skies? It could be Beast of Airport Road. Or...
Yeah, I mean, Terror in the Skies opens with a scene that I had sort of dreamed up long before I'd even really definitively figured out what Terror in the Skies was. And it was just this scene that was going to focus on a little boy who wanted to be a pilot. You know, like clearly had a very like interest in discovery, and you know, it just kind of captured like a pioneer spirit. And so I went out and shot that entire scene sort of myself with my nephew Graydon. And it came out exactly how I wanted it to, which is not typically the case. And it's even crazier if you sort of realize that we shot the entire movie, or we shot the, not entire movie, but we shot that entire scene in like a day and a half. And it's a very, it's a pretty like detailed scene in terms of like what we're doing with his action and all that kind of stuff, and needing the sky to look a certain way, which it ended up looking a certain way. And it just, everything about that opening to Terror in the Skies, the bookend scene is exactly what I wanted it to be going into it. And then there's a closing scene in that movie as well, of this abandoned house that we had sort of found by luck out in the middle of nowhere in Illinois. Those two things, like the way those scenes sort of bookend the movie, are perfect. And they're probably 2 of my favorite things that we've ever done.
Okay. Now moving on to Momo, which has not as yet come out yet, but why don't you tell us a little bit about it, or as much of it as you want to?
Yeah, that is so. That is like that's probably the weirdest movie we've ever made, which is saying something. Momo is a love letter to like 70s grindhouse cinema and like cable access, like horror hosts.
Okay.
It is a very, very, very detailed movie. It's a, like I said earlier, it's like 50% narrative, 50% documentary. However, the narrative is very, very much, it serves a purpose and it's there for a reason. It's there to sort of distinguish the difference between fiction and reality.
Okay.
And I've compared it to like Rashomon maybe a little bit, with the sort of documentary aspects of the film setting the record straight on what the fictional retelling of the story gets wrong. And I think audiences are going to have a blast with the movie and have a lot of fun. I think there's going to be a lot of like laughing and silly jump scares and stuff like that, but I think it's going to serve a purpose beyond just being entertaining and fun. I think uh it's a very sort of insightful look at um how myths are made and how stories can become something, how a real event can become something other than you know what it started its life as. And
Okay.
I'm really excited. Yeah, I'm really excited about that one. It really was. There was a writing process. There was a whole writing team of myself and Jason Udis and Mark Matsky, who sat down and sort of hammered out all the details of the movie. And then we had to go through this entire insanity of like shooting a narrative film and a documentary simultaneously. And I can tell you from like editing it day in and day out right now, I think it's going to end up being like sort of the definitive small town monsters movie. Like I think it'll be the one that people really love and revisit and look to as being like the one that when someone asks them what is small town monsters, they say, well, check this out, and this will kind of explain the whole thing to you.
Just one more thing on how much research went into the Terror in the Skies and Momo, which I know that those are two of your most recent productions.
Yeah. Yeah, Terror in the Skies is pretty easy, like from a research standpoint. It
Okay.
didn't require a ton. Momo, on the other hand, I actually brought on a research assistant, Heather Mosier, who helped me out with a lot of the preliminary research, and she was sort of the genius behind tracking down a lot of the people tied to that original case. And unfortunately, like many of those people are either dead and gone or don't want to talk about it. But we were able to turn up some really great interviews with locals, from Louisiana, Missouri, and that's what I'm talking about with like the movie being sort of the quintessential small town monsters movie. I just don't think any other STM movie has managed to capture the sort of like small town hysteria that can grow around one of these monster cases like this movie does. It really captures the hysteria of the time and how excited people got about the idea of a giant hairy monster walking around behind their house.
Okay. Very cool. So, where do you think that the future of small town monsters will be taking you next after?
Yeah, like I said, we actually start filming on the Trail of UFOs in Nevada and Arizona in about 2 weeks. We'll be out at Area 51 and all those Sedona and all that kind of stuff. We'll be out there in a couple of weeks. And then from there, we'll be going to start production on the Mothman Legacy. And I actually might even be doing some early filming for the Mothman Legacy in the next couple of weeks. And that will be sort of a direct sequel to the Mothman of Point Pleasant.
Oh, okay.
And then after that, it's the Mark of the Bell Witch, which is probably going to be that'll be our late 2020 release. So those are the next 3 STM projects that we're working on.
Okay, very cool. Now, where can we find your merchandise and other things of that nature, so that the audience may know?
Yeah, I mean, if people want to watch our movies, a lot of them are on Amazon Prime. You can check out Amazon or Vimeo on Demand or VidiSpace. Smalltownmonsters.com has DVDs. The good thing about the DVDs is they include like bonus features, and we always do these little like 15 to 20 minute behind the scenes making of documentaries that are on the DVDs. The Boggy Creek Monster DVD actually has like 2 hours through 2 or 3 hours worth of behind the scenes stuff on it. So it's actually pretty crazy. But yeah, if you want to be a Small Town Monsters supporter, that's always the best way. Other than at the beginning of each year, around beginning of February, we launch a Kickstarter to fund all the projects we work on throughout the year. So those are the best ways, and following us on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all that as well.
Okay, very cool. Now, if there was someone who suddenly was walking past you on the street and looked at you and were like, "Oh, wait a minute, aren't you that Seth Breedlove guy? What documentary of yours would you recommend that person if they had not yet seen your documentary?"
Probably, yeah, it's probably The Mothman of Point Pleasant or Invasion on Chestnut Ridge. I think those two really boil down what we do, and they both turned out quite well. And we're all pretty proud of how both of those movies came out. So it'd be one of those two.
Okay, very cool. Well, I appreciate you being able to come on and at least somewhat explain to those that are out there and a little bit about yourself and to me. I'm more or less a listener, and I love hearing the stories how directors and actors and editors do their work, and I appreciate you coming on the show. So
yeah, thanks so much for having me on and talking about filmmaking rather than just have me tell scary stories the whole time.
Well, if I had you tell exactly what they were about, then people would have no interest in seeing them.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, so is there anything else that you would like the audience to know before we wrap up here?
No, that's it, man. We hit it all. So no, just thanks again for having me on.
Definitely, man. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, folks. But definitely check out Seth's work, and hopefully he'll impress a lot more people with his work here. So thank you for listening, and have a great day, evening, or morning wherever you are, folks. Thank you so much. Alrighty.